Welcome to Transformative Principal, where I help you stop putting out fires and start leading. I'm your host, Jethro Jones. You can follow me on Twitter at Jethro Jones. Welcome to the Transformative Principal / Resilient Schools podcast. As you know, I recently started this new podcast called Resilient Schools, and I think that my topic today really goes well with that. So we're going to simulcast this on both of those shows. I'm excited to have Dr. Henry J. Turner here on the program with me today. He's an award-winning high school principal, author, and nationally renowned speaker. He is most proud of the collaborative community he works within to empower students to fight hate and bigotry in their school. Pointing to his unwavering commitment to equity and a student-centered culture, Henry was named the 2020 K-12 Principal of the Year by K-12 Dive. Henry is the author of the newly released book, Change the Narrative: How to Foster an Anti-Racist Culture in Your School, published by DBC Inc. As a national speaker, he shares his experience as an innovative instructional leader, passionate advocate, and committed anti-racist educator with educators and organizational leaders. Henry works with educators, leaders, and communities on how to create a culture that commits to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and empowers students' voices and addresses economic and racial disparities. He has a bi-weekly newsletter, Lessons on Social Justice Leadership, that can be found at henryjturner.com. And if you want to go way back in the archives, you can go back to episode 88 from Transformative Principal, which is a long time ago, where I had him on and he talked about site visits in that episode, and then I had him on for a second time in episode 89. So we've been talking about this stuff for a long time, and Henry especially. This is not a new area. So Henry, welcome to Transformative Principal.
It's good to be with you again, Jethro. Thanks for having me.
Oh, man. I'm excited to talk with you. What's so funny about this situation is that somebody else said, man, Henry's awesome. You should have him on your podcast. And I said, okay, that sounds good. And then I messaged you and I was like, that name sounds so familiar. And went back, and sure enough, you have already been on the podcast. And it's great when you get a repeat referral saying you should go on this podcast, and you're like, I've already done that. That's awesome.
It was a great exchange, because it brought me back to a while ago when we connected, and definitely a different place in my work and as a principalship. Hopefully I've learned a lot more, and really excited that it brought us back together.
Yeah, so that was all the way back in 2015. And the title of that podcast, episode 89, was Facing History and Ourselves. And, you know, we talked about how you were using this anti-bullying program, facing history and ourselves. And I just think it's really amazing to see how lives go and what paths we take and where we're at. So now you've got this book about being an anti-racist leader. So let's talk about first, what does that mean to be an anti-racist teacher or leader in a school?
So an anti-racist leader is someone who believes that racism exists in our society, that race is a social fabric that has been created in our society, and that our schools were built with that fabric as well, and that our work as educators is to, if we believe in all students excelling, is that we need to acknowledge the disparities that exist, the problems that have created those disparities, and how we address them so that all students can achieve. And what that means is thinking through an equitable lens, one that thinks about what do students need. What is their culture? How do I make sure I respond to their cultural needs? And how do I understand the societal impact of racism on particular students? And how do I address them in my school?
So I have some issues with the term anti-racism. One of which is that it paints us into this black and white type of mentality. What is the purpose of that? What is the benefit of starting there? And then I have a follow-up question to that after you answer that one.
Yeah. So when you say black and white, I'm not sure if you mean either or racially, but I would say that from that we do need to understand that school, and we actually spend a good amount of time in the book talking about this, is that school was founded on separating students. That what students were going to go to university, what students were going to become managers, what students were going to be workers, and what students were excluded. And that's the history of our system. And that history has had an impact on how students feel connected in our school.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't see that to mean just the African American story, but actually the story of all students of color. So whether it's the Asian story, the Latinx story, the Native American story, there are structures and systems in our schools that show students that their school is not for them. And I think that is true for other ways in which students identify as well. And the reason why I think it's important, and I think it goes back to your question, when you mentioned that our first conversation we talked about facing history in ourselves, is that we have to understand the ways in which students feel disconnected in order to connect them. And race is one of those places where we tend to avoid because we feel like it's hard. And what I suggest is that if we focus on race, we're going to be able to focus on the other ways students identify, whether it's income, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality, any of those areas, because race plays a role in all of those places as well.
And I appreciate that aspect, that if we can talk about the racism part, then we can talk about the other areas where kids are separated. So going back to what you said originally or earlier, that school is founded on separating students, that is absolutely correct. And we separate them by age, sometimes by gender, sometimes by race, sometimes by their capacity or where they can go to. And the other thing that's really personal to me is separating kids based on their disabilities. And that's an area where there's still a huge amount of segregation in our schools as it relates to disabilities, that kids with disabilities are very often intentionally very separated from the rest of their peers, and that's not good either. So any of these things that we do to divide or separate us is what the challenge is. And you actually answered my second question in your response to the first one, which I really appreciate, because it is about that. Like, is this just about race, or is this about any kind of separation that tries to separate kids out into these arbitrary distinctions that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things? Is that a fair way to ask that? Does that make sense?
It's a fair question. I'll just give you an example, I think, to help answer the question. But I'll answer this in a different way, which is that when I arrived at my school, 25% of students were on IEPs, which is way above the average. Yes. In our state. 50% of our Black students, 50% of our Black students were on an IEP. And so one way to try to address the overrepresentation that we had of just students with disabilities is to understand why do so many students have an IEP? Is it that every student is disabled, or is it the process that we are using to identify students with a disability who are not making effective progress? If we ignored race, if we used a colorblind approach there, we would miss that 50%, and not even so double what the school percentage was.
Which was already high, right?
Which is already high,
yeah.
Right? We would have missed that if we didn't consider race, and if we didn't understand, the history of overrepresentation of Black students on IEPs, we may not have asked that question, right? And so it is true that that the approach that we use in our book, and I think the approach that we've used as a school to address disparities, also help you to address the disparities, the bias, the hate that exists for other groups as well. However, it allows you to do it in a much more thoughtful way because you're recognizing that race plays a role in all of these areas, right? So if we just say we're just going to focus on students with disabilities, but we're not going to talk about race, well, you're missing that race plays a role in how your school works with students with disabilities, right? If you're just going to focus on students who are low income and you don't recognize race, then you're going to miss an important part of that narrative.
And I do think that one of the good things that came out of No Child Left Behind is that we started looking at race in test scores and achievement and things like that we had never disaggregated that before, at least not systemically, and that did bring about that new idea of disaggregating and seeing which populations were more heavily impacted. And I remember my first couple of years teaching, I was at an inner city area in Salt Lake City, and we had large populations of Polynesian and Mexican and African American communities, and we could see that our school was doing well overall, but because of those, looking at those minority groups and how they were doing, we saw that they had a much higher failure rate than the rest of the school, but the school as a whole looked good. And so I think your point is valid there, and a wise approach to say, we have to recognize that these things do play a role and find a way to deal with it appropriately. Now, a lot of school leaders are nervous about starting this conversation because they think that it'll be divisive. What advice would you give them about those nerves of being scared about starting it?
Yeah, and I'd also just say to your first point is that you asked the question, what is anti-racism, and I'll say the definition of racism that I use goes all the way back from the 1970s, which is it's a system of advantage based on race. From David Wellman, it's the same definition that is Beverly Daniels uses in Why Do All the Black Children Sit Together in the Cafeteria in the 1990s. It's one that she uses in her 20th edition in 2018. And Ibram Kendi in How to Be an Anti-Racist says that pushes us to recognize who is racism, who are we blaming for these disparities, right? And so to your question, when we have students who are not doing as well as other students, certain racial groups who are not doing as well as other racial groups in a school, is the question, what is wrong with these students, or the question, what is wrong with the school, right? And I think that would be my pushback to No Child Left Behind, is that it placed a lot of blame on the students. And I think that the thing we need to ask is, what are we doing as a system? What are we doing as a school that's not allowing students to flourish and to thrive? And I think that that's the way to help other leaders to recognize the importance of this work, right? That the importance of this work is because I believe, and the research shows, is that Ed Week did a study in 2020. 80% of educators want to do racial justice work in their schools. And the pushback is the stories that get promoted, I think, problematically, which is that that talking about race is really talking about white students to feel bad about themselves. That's not what this is about, right? And it's the same thing with bullying, is that it's about teaching students to stand up for others, right? That's the same thing as anti-bullying work, so that it shouldn't be controversial, and it's just, it has been made controversial in our society, which is why I understand the pressure that leaders are feeling. And what I would say is start small, right? Like I believe that a lot of leaders want to do what's right for all students, so start small. So it may not be looking at your your special ed data, it may not be looking at ways in which your grading is inequitable. It may just be, how do you make sure the students are seen, right? And so the easiest thing that we did in our school is that we allowed students to write in their student information system how to pronounce their name. It's the easiest thing that we did. Teachers feel bad when they mispronounce a student's name, right? And a student, by the time they get into high school, they've heard it for 13 years of their life, of someone mispronouncing their name. And so we allowed students to write it phonetically, and in our student learning system, they can be recorded saying their name. And so a teacher hears that. So on day one, a student feels seen, right? That's anti-racist and it's student connection, right? It's SEL. So to me, it's, we don't have to think of this work as, as something that's going to push you into feeling something that your school's not ready for. You can start with some small steps to help your community to see that we want students to feel connected in their school, to feel empowered in their school, so that they'll be successful.
Mm-hmm. And what I really like about that example is that my name is Jethro, and even though it's pretty clear how to say it phonetically, it's some people still struggle with it. And I have my whole life gotten questioning looks and weird, comments about my name and different things like that. And one thing that was ensured was that I was seen because I had the attention because of my unique name. And it really does matter that someone does feel seen, and it means the world to them every time when they're seen positively. Let me clarify that. By saying their name correctly, for example. I think that's really good, and that's not something that you have to do a ton of extra work to make happen, but that's a really simple, easy place to start. And I really like that because it's affirming to everybody and making sure that everybody's seen, not just some kids. Sometimes we go overboard and we do something to, really make sure that the whatever minority we're looking at has the attention, and then we say stupid things and do stupid things that don't actually help the situation and make them feel even worse. And I've seen several examples of that in my career, where an attempt to be supportive turns out to be totally inappropriate, and that's not what we want to do either.
Totally agree. I think that a classic example is by reaching out to, say, you're working on a history of Chinese immigration, and you reach out to a student who is Chinese American. You say, "You're Chinese American. Why don't you give us this, your perspective on this history?" Right? You represent the entire group, right? And so the intent is good, the impact is bad, right? Mm-hmm. And because it's about you're putting pressure on a student, and so the way to allow students to feel included in your class is to empower them, right? Is to help them to, like we said, with pronouncing their name, to help them to feel seen, to help them. What are the things that you need, right, to feel empowered in the class? What are the topics that are going to trigger you? What are the topics that are going to impact you? And building a relationship with a student so that they feel comfortable that when, regardless of what the topic is, they can share their perspective, right? Another example that I would say is problematic is, let's say you're reading a book like Huckleberry Finn, and you allow for a class debate on whether we're going to use the N-word or not, right? And is that empowering to students? Sure. Does it create an unsafe environment for students, particularly those who are offended by the N-word? Absolutely, right? And so recognizing the impact that particular topics, conversations may have on students, it doesn't mean that you don't talk about why the N-word is used in that book, right? But you as a teacher help to create a safe environment, so and to avoid a place where students feel like, well, I just got shut down because I'm the one Black student in the class, right? How do you make sure that students feel safe? How do you make sure they feel seen in your class, are just these important steps.
Yeah, so you gave a couple of good negative examples. How about some good other positive examples besides the how do you pronounce your name in the student information system? What are some other ideas that people could do to start wading into this?
So I always think that building relationships with students is the number one strategy, and so creating agreements with students. What are the ways in which we're going to have discussions? Helping students to know your value system. That we are going to talk about some challenging things. We're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about other types of difference. And I'm going to help you to develop the skills to be able to talk about these kinds of topics and to bring them along through a series of strategies. And part of it is doing some identity work initially. So asking them, what is your first experience involving race or racism, right? Allow them to tell their story about it and to share it. The way in which I do that activity is the person shares with another person. There are no questions, there's no engagement. It's just letting that person tell the story. Another activity that you can do just as a warm up really early on in the year is a name activity, which is so my name is Henry Jamal Turner, and I'm going to share the history of those three names. So Henry, I'm the fourth Henry in my family. I got it from my father and kind of shared that history. Turner, share what I know about the Turners and share why I got my middle name. We all love talking about ourselves, right? And like you just shared, like with your name, you have a story behind it. We can spend a long time talking about that. That helps us also learn both the name activity and your history with your first history with race. Allows us to realize that talking about race doesn't have to be hyper tense, doesn't have to be stressful, and sometimes we may laugh and be enjoyable. And so those are good ways to really to help bring the topic into your classroom. And then as you're bringing in layering your content, so whether it is history content or even in math classes, we have statistics teachers who are bringing in statistical disparities that exist in our society. Like when you bring that stuff in, you've had a long process of being able to talk about race, talk about your own relationship with race, that students feel more comfortable being able to talk about it and understanding the different perspectives that exist in the classroom.
So, what do you say to those who say that these examples that you've given are too fluffy and they're not real and they're not really addressing the issues? What's your response to that?
So I would say that that's the way to begin the work. I think that if you want to talk about systemic racism on the first day of your class, without creating any structure or support, you're creating an unsafe environment for your students. And so so talking about race really begins with talking about us. And I think in the beginning of the year, you need to do this, real SEL focused kind of ideas, relationship focused strategies, so that you can then build into topics that are more challenging. I think, if you're reading a book that where race is a theme, is your first book, you want to be thoughtful in terms of, is this going to create stress where my class feels or students feel unsafe in my classroom, particularly my students of color? Or is this one that helps the students understand more about themselves so that we can get into some of the more challenging components of our society? So I think that's just effective teaching, right? Is to help focus on relationships, build over the course of the year so that you can get into the more challenging conversations. I think all out debate on the first day of school is not going to end well or being a good learning experience for students.
Right. Because you don't have that trust built up yet that allows you to push. And Dr. Zaretta Hammond talked about this when I interviewed her a few years ago. She said that you need to have that relationship so that when the tough conversations need to come, then you can have those tough conversations. And it's not enough to just say, we're going to talk about this now. We're going to talk about race and how people are racist and how our system is racist, and just throw that on people the first day. That doesn't make anybody feel comfortable. because it's too much too soon. And so what would you say about, if you've done this in your school, how important are these relationship building things, even if you've already had difficult, deep conversations at a new school year to start out the year?
So I think that so I think going back to this point that I made earlier, which is like, who are we blaming for the problem, right? Are we blaming our students, or are we blaming ourselves, right? And we're reflecting on how we can be better. So I've heard, many educators say, well, whenever we talk about race, my students of color never want to talk. Well, is that because the kids are the problem, or is there something that I'm doing in the classroom that's not
Mm-hmm.
making them feel comfortable, right? And so that is the reason why we want to focus on relationships. We want to focus on community in the beginning, recognizing that in our classroom, this is not competition, right? This is about all of us learning together, how we support each other, and that it's important to learn with people who think and learn differently with me. It's why I really advocate for thinking about how our leveling system sometimes can prevent students who learn differently from learning together, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we build a community recognizing that we think and learn differently, and build that community of support, so that when we get into some of the harder topics in the middle of the year, that foundation exists, and students then can come to me because they trust me as the teacher to say, hey, I did not feel okay in that class, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that I can help them.
I think the last thing that I want to do here is share a story with one of my students who was an African American student who was always getting into trouble. And he wasn't really getting into trouble himself, but he was very loud and he was very big. So all the attention was on him anytime he was around. He just stuck out, is really all there was to it. And he wanted to be a good person, but felt like he was always put in compromising situations over and over and over again. And the whole entire year, I had dozens and dozens of conversations with him about how to make good choices and do the right thing. And he just struggled mightily, not to mention his home life that was difficult and all that. And I'll never forget, 3 days before school got out, he got in a fight. And at this point, he finally said, I was scared. I didn't know what to do. And for him to actually say that to me means that he had to trust me enough to be vulnerable about what was going on. And I don't think that this was anything that I did particularly, except that I cared about him as a human being and treated him how I think was fair every single time. And after all this time, he finally opened up, and and then our relationship was over. Like, school was out 3 days later, and he wasn't my student anymore. But the reason why I bring this up is because later, like a year and a half later, I was at the high school. I was taking something in, and I had broken my foot, and I was on a little scooter, and I needed some help. And who walked up late to school was this kid who had just struggled mightily. And he was going into in-school suspension. But you know what he did? He offered to help me. He opened the door for me. He carried the box I was bringing in, and he was a good kid who was just trying to do the best he could with what he had. And it was so hard to see him that way because of all the trouble and stuff that he got into. But once I broke through that barrier and he could trust me and I could trust him, then we were able to have a good relationship. So, but it took all year long, and we want things to happen sooner, and because we have good intentions, we want people to know these things about us right away, but it takes time even if we're trying really hard. So sometimes people might get discouraged and think this is not going anywhere. I've worked with this kid or this class all year long, nothing's changed. What words of hope would you give to people in that situation?
So 2 points. One is that it's an awesome story. The question, if you shared that to me as sort of like your end of the year reflection, I was your administrator, I would say, well, maybe go ask him, what did I do over the course of the year for you to feel comfortable sharing that with me, so that I could help future students sooner, and make that connection sooner. And the second is that I think it's pretty amazing that he told you the last day of school, because sometimes we don't know the impact that we make on students until several years
Right.
later. And a very quick story is that it's actually the beginning of our introduction in the book is the story of a student called Lamari, excuse me, and she came back from to speak with a group of students of color, she's a black female, and she shares the story about how she had imposter syndrome when she was at this big public university, being one of the few black students in this math class. And she thought, am I going to fail? Am I going to succeed? And she realized in this lecture hall statistics course that not only was she well prepared, but she found herself tutoring two white male students in this class. And she recognized the moment of her, as with, in two groups that have traditionally have not felt welcome in STEM. Here she is tutoring two students who, STEM has been very welcoming to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, to me, that shows that our school did well preparing her to understand that moment and to do well in statistics, right? Both are important. But additionally, that story shows that you never know the impact that you make, right? And here are the students sharing the story when she came back from college. We finally learned that, wow, we made this kind of difference in this student.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that is so much in education. Like you said, we hear about the good things way too late, and the reality is we are making an impact even if we don't see it right away.
Absolutely.
If we're doing the right things, and if we're doing the wrong things, we make a negative impact that can last forever. And I think if we just put in our best effort every single day and do what we can with what we know, then we're going to be able to find success. And if we're constantly looking at ourselves and saying, how am I doing in this? Am I making the right steps? I think we'll be able to see the ways that we can get better. Just want to thank you again, Henry, for coming on the podcast. It's awesome talking to you again, and so glad that somebody else referred us. Appreciate that, Steve, at MyFlex Learning. That was awesome.
Absolutely. Really appreciate the conversation, and thanks again. Hope to do another time as well.
Yep. And if you want to get his book, henryjturner.com. You can follow him on Twitter at TurnerHJ. Thanks again, Henry. Have a great day. Appreciate you being here.
You too. Thank you.